You trying to tell me this guy's supposed to be scary? Hey everybody, welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. My name is Professor Victor, and I'll be your host as we go through all of the essential, noteworthy, interesting, and notorious modern horror films. If you're new to the channel, I highly recommend that you check out our introduction video. There's a link to that in the description below, and it'll help explain to you what the Horror Movie Syllabus is all about. But in short, what we're going to do is look at a specific subgenre of horror and then examine 3 specific representative films of that subgenre. Today we're talking about animal horror movies, and this should be a pretty fun video because these movies tend to be on the fun side. Sometimes when we're looking at other subgenres, some of the movie selections are a little serious or a little heavy, and we've been looking at a lot of heavy movies lately. These ones should, for the most part, be a blast. Now, it's interesting to note that the animal horror movie seems to wax and wane in popularity over the years. There are time periods like, I think, late 70s, early 80s where they were very popular, and then they seem to kind of just fade away for a little while, and then they come back stronger. In the 90s, there was a little bit of a resurgence, and we've seen a little bit of a resurgence recently, and we'll talk about that in just a little bit. Now, full disclosure, the animal subgenre is not one that I'm emphatically a fan of. I'm not as passionate about it as I am about some of the other subgenres that we've talked about. And that might be a bit surprising to some of you who have seen previous videos and seen me talk about animals in previous videos. And I think the reason is simply because I'm usually rooting for the animals. You're not really supposed to be. You're usually supposed to be rooting for the humans who are being attacked by the animals, but I'm oftentimes rooting for the animals in those movies. And spoiler alert, they rarely come out on top. Uh, I'm not sure if that really is the way it's supposed to go, but that's kind of where I land. That said, I do tend to really enjoy these movies, and in particular, the ones that we're talking about today are ones that I really, really like. So I'm excited to bring them up and go over them with you because this is a subgenre that, again, while its popularity seems to come and go, these movies tend to endure for the most part as cult classics. There's very rarely an animal horror film that is going to be a prestige film or an elevated horror movie. They're mostly just camp fun or cult classic type movies, and I have a special place in my heart for those. So, with all that said, why don't we go ahead and dive right into these movies? As usual, we're putting them in order of undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate level, and in this case, they're merely indicating the chronological order of the films. The first movie we're talking about today, the undergraduate level selection, is Cujo. Cujo came out in 1983 and is based on the Stephen King novel of the same name. We will be talking about Stephen King quite a bit on this channel. In fact, there's going to be a Stephen King subgenre, but his movies are going to pop up all over the place on the syllabus, including right here with Cujo. And that's because Cujo is, for at least for fans of a certain age, a quintessential or watershed animal horror film. If you haven't seen it, the movie is about a dog that gets bitten and winds up going rabid and traps a mother and her young son in a car on an abandoned, I think it's an auto lot, in the hot sun in the desert. So they're trapped. They're cooking in a car. They don't have any water. They have no way of getting help. And this giant rabid dog, huge dog, is pinning them into this car, and they need to figure out what they're going to do to survive. It's a classic in the animal subgenre, and for good reason. The movie is very, very effective. It does a really good job of putting you in that situation that the characters are in, that I think is very effective when a horror movie does this, where you have to think about how you would try to get out of the situation or what you would do to try to save yourself. And this movie is a good one in the sense that, you'll think, oh, I would try to do this, and then the characters will try to do that and it doesn't work, and then you'll say, I'll try to do this, and the same thing happens again. And I love that kind of stuff. I love a movie that takes the things that you would be thinking of to do and kind of turns them on their head, or kind of cuts them off, walls them off as a viable solution to the problem. That's a lot of fun because that's when you start to feel the dread. That's when the tension of the movie really is effective. It's kind of a running joke that horror movies, that the characters do stupid things that they shouldn't do. They run upstairs instead of going out. Scream talked about this at length. And it's true. There's a lot of movies that do that. So I like when a movie does it in a way that makes you realize, no. They're doing things the way you do them, or you wouldn't really have any better ideas than what the characters are having. And Cujo does that really, really well. A large part of why Cujo works is because of Dee Wallace, Scream Queen legend extraordinaire, who we will talk about quite a bit on this channel. I think we've either talked about her before or we've at least talked about movies she's been in previously. But she's front and center here as the mom trapped in the car with her son. Her son played by Danny Pintaro, who is from the show Who's the Boss in the 80s, if you're old enough to remember that. It's where Alyssa Milano got her start. We will be talking about Alyssa Milano quite a bit in the future. But for now, let's talk about Dee Wallace because she is exceptional in the movie. She's holding this down. The movie is, in a large part, Dee Wallace and a dog and a child. But the child is, he's being a child. But Dee Wallace is the reason why the movie works. Without her performance, the movie falls apart. You're basically you're basically following just her, and she's got the movie on her back. And if you don't buy into her reactions, and if you don't buy into her performance, you're going to be out on the movie. You're just going to tune out. But it works out really, really well because she is more than up to the task. She's an exceptional actress. Like I said, we'll talk about her many times, but she holds this movie down really, really well. Now, as I mentioned, this movie is based on a Stephen King book, and I've actually never read that book. I've read a few Stephen King books, and when we talk more about Stephen King specifically, I'll go into that more. But Cujo, from what I understand, is an excellent book, but there's apparently parts of the book that are from the point of view of the dog, which I find absolutely fascinating and does make me kind of want to go back and read that book. But I would say that, without spoiling too much what we're going to talk about in Stephen King in the future, that this is one of the Stephen King movies that works really well. I do believe that Stephen King movies have a tendency to not be great. There is a pantheon of Stephen King movies that we'll be talking about, pretty much all of them, that are exceptional. And then there's a lot of Stephen King movies or movies based on Stephen King books that are not good. I'm happy to say Cujo's in the list over here. It's really great. Now, to be fair, full disclosure, the first time I saw Cujo was back when it came out in the 80s when I was a child. Scared the hell out of me. I mean, as a kid, I had a fear of dogs. I don't anymore. I love dogs. But as a kid, I was afraid of them. And I'm pretty sure that it is a big part of that was because of this movie. Getting older and watching it, you kind of see it more as a tragedy. This dog is a sweet dog that just goes rabid when it gets bitten. And it's really, really unfortunate because that happens in real life all the time. And it's just depressing. And so I actually see Cujo now as more of a tragedy. Again, like I said, I'm usually rooting for the animal. I'm not rooting for Cujo so much in this movie. I'm actually right there with the protagonists of the film. I feel bad for Cujo. He's not exactly a villain in the movie. He's sick. And so that makes it kind of sad, which I'll be honest with you, undercuts the fun of the movie a little bit for me these days. I don't watch it as much nowadays as I might have in the future because it does make me a little bit sad, which maybe is a little ridiculous for, an 80s schlocky horror movie based on a Stephen King book, but there it is. I feel bad for Cujo and what he's going through more than I feel bad for Danny Pintaro. I could care less about that kid. And for those of you who watched our pregnancy video recently, you know how I feel about kids. They're all demon spawn. Anyways, I digress. We're getting off topic here. Suffice to say, Cujo, if you haven't seen it, is definitely worth your time. It's very well made. It's really good at ratcheting up the tension. The dog is fantastic, and he's very scary. He's very big. Dee Wallace is really great. There's some side plots that don't add a lot to the movie, but they do help to reinforce why the situation is happening and why these two people are trapped by themselves without help. And of course, you have to remember the time period that it was made in. There's no cell phones to call for help or anything like that. So you kind of have to remind yourself of that, or put yourself in that position and kind of like ignore modern ways that this would not happen to get into the movie. But I still think it holds up. I still think it works rather well, and definitely would be a good use of your time. So if you haven't seen Cujo, I do recommend it. I do think you should check it out, and then let us know what you think in the comments, of course. The next movie that we're discussing today, the graduate level movie, is it's Lake Placid. Now, Lake Placid came out in 1999, and this movie is absolutely fun. This movie is a total blast, a total ride. It's the fun level up to 11. There's not going to be a whole lot of tragedy here, so it's just a wild ride that you can enjoy. If you're not familiar with it, in short, there is a giant, massive crocodile that is terrorizing Lake Placid, fishing game guy and some other government officials have been tasked with trying to solve the problem of the giant crocodile. And we'll leave it at that because to give you specific details, of course, spoils the movie, and we don't like to do that here. Suffice to say, the movie is out to have a good time, and on this, it succeeds in spades. The movie knows what you're here for. You're here for animal attacks and gore and some funny stuff, and it's going to give all of that to you. It's not trying to be any deeper than it is, and that's, I think, the recipe for success for pretty much any animal horror film is give you the schlocky goods, give you the gore, give you the attacks, give you some tension, give you some fun, and get out. That's what you need to do. You don't want to get too messagey. You don't want to get too heady or serious. That's the recipe for a good time. Keep it simple, keep it fun. And Lake Placid definitely gets the recipe right. One of the things about Lake Placid is that it's got a stupendous cast. There's a lot of recognizable names in there. There's Bill Pullman and Bridget Fonda, Brendan Gleeson, Oliver Platt, Betty White. Betty White is in the movie, and of course, as you might suspect, she steals every scene she's in. She's fantastic. The movie benefits from having quality actors that are recognizable in the role. It makes you not take the movie more seriously like in terms of plot, because it's not a tremendously serious movie, but more like in terms of quality. You recognize that the movie is kind of intentionally cheesy and not just being poorly made. It's with the pedigree of actors in there, it's very clear this movie had a budget, and this movie was being made with love and with talent, and so you take the production a little bit more seriously, I think, and then you're able to have a lot more fun with it because you realize it's not like oh, I'm laughing at this movie. You're laughing with the movie. They want you to be laughing when you're laughing, and they want you to be freaked out when you're freaked out. Absolutely fun, absolutely great. I mean, you see, I keep coming back to the word fun, and there's a reason for that. This movie is a total blast. And I'm not the only one who thinks so. The movie was very successful and has spawned several sequels. I think to date there's like 5 sequels. I haven't even seen all of them, but the ones I have seen, which I've seen the first couple of sequels, are fun too. Diminishing returns as usual. They're not as good as the original, but they're still a lot of fun because again, they've got the formula down pat. They know what you're looking for in terms of a good time animal horror film, and they're willing to give it to you. They've even done a crossover with Anaconda, and I haven't watched that one yet, but I aim to because the Anaconda movies, which unfortunately we're not talking about today, but maybe deserve a shout out because they're pretty fun too. Giant snake movie, can't go wrong with that. I think that that's a fun idea for a crossover. Giant snake versus giant crocodile, count me in. I'm down for that. So I am eager to see that one. I just haven't picked it up yet. But the Lake Placid movies have shown that there's an audience for them. Now these are straight to video movies, so be aware of that. But I'm no snob when it comes to direct to video, and they're having a good time. The quality is good enough, maybe not on par with the original, but good enough to not really take you out of it, or really if it does take you out of it, it's in a fun, campy way, so you're very forgiving to it. But if you're down to have a good time, if you're not trying to take things too seriously, and you like a bit of animal violence, and you like to see animals eat people, like I do, then Lake Placid is going to be your jam. That's going to be one for you. So if that sounds like it's up your alley, Lake Placid gets a recommendation from me. I really would endorse this one for a good time. It's a good party movie, or it's a good movie if you're, sitting home alone and just want to be entertained and not, kind of turn your brain half off. This is a good one to go with. And the last movie that we're talking about today, our postgraduate level movie, is Black Sheep. And if you ever were watching a zombie movie and said to yourself, you know what would make this movie better is if the zombies were sheep, then I have the movie for you. Black Sheep is a New Zealand film that came out in 2006, and it's probably like nothing you've ever seen before. It is the story of a man who I think he used to live on a farm, or he's re-inheriting the farm. I forget off the top of my head. But now his sheep farm, is being used to experiment on sheep, and more specifically to create genetically mutated carnivorous sheep, sheep zombies, if you will, that have a taste for human flesh. It's as ridiculous and dumb and awesome as it sounds. This movie is incredibly funny and incredibly gory. We've talked about this kind of horror comedy in the past that is really funny but also incredibly like bloody and gory. We talked about Dead Alive in the past. We've talked about Shaun of the Dead. We've talked about Tucker and Dale versus Evil. And if you've got the constitution for some heavy gore, these movies can be a great time, a wild ride. And Black Sheep is right there with these in terms of just how much fun this movie is having. It knows that it's a stupid premise, and it's running with it. With reckless abandon, with glee. It's really having a tremendous amount of fun of vilifying sheep, which were probably some of the most benign and docile creatures you could think of to turn into carnivorous, raging monster animals. And it's great. I don't know whose demented idea it was, but it pays off. The sheep totally work in terms of being like scary but funny. And a big part of why is because the sheep designs, the effects, are done by Weta. And those of you film nerds who are familiar with, you know, the behind the scenes things making movies recognize that name, I'm sure. For those of you who don't, the movie Lord of the Rings is probably the most famous Weta production. Also, the Planet of the Apes movies. These guys know what they're doing in terms of making effects and creatures that look extremely realistic. Well, they're based in New Zealand, and so early on in the Weta, you know, life cycle or whatever you want to call it, they're a small company and they're doing movies like Black Sheep, and their talent shines through. The sheep look awesome. Do they look realistic? Not exactly, because there's no such thing as a genetically mutated carnivore sheep zombie. You know, but if there was, this is probably what they would look like. Weta does a great job, and that's, I think, essential to why this movie is so much fun and why it's so good. Because they look campy and schlocky, but also really gross and really freaky. Weta, you know, tip your hat to them, because they do a killer job here, and it's no surprise that they go on to do some incredible stuff that is, of a higher echelon or, a higher caliber of film. Because Black Sheep, let's be honest, it's a schlocky horror film. It's a B movie, but made with some really, really good effects, really good talent. It's got a pretty decent script. It's got some good acting in it. The jokes land. The physical comedy lands, the gore lands all over the place. Black Sheep, as you can tell, I'm pretty effusive about that. This is a movie that I saw a trailer for off of another horror film. And I'm like, I need to see that. And so I sought it out. It was not a huge hit out here in America, at least. But I was glad I sought it out. And it's got a small cult following. It's kind of like, if you know, you know. If you've seen this movie, you generally like this movie. I don't think I've ever come across anybody who's seen Black Sheep and was like, that movie sucks. I've never seen it. Because if you at least if you're looking for, you know, a fun schlocky animal horror movie, if you're not, then if you're looking for something deeper, if you're looking for the Citizen Kane of animal horror, this ain't it. But if you're looking for a ride, a good time, this is definitely one for you. I can't praise it enough, obviously. And there's been a theme going on in this video that all the movies that we're picking, by and large, Cujo maybe a little bit on the fringe here, but they're fun movies. And I said at the beginning of this video, animal movies are supposed to be fun. They're supposed to be enjoyable. They're not supposed to be too intellectual or heavy or depressing. And I think Black Sheep is probably the pinnacle of that. So even though, chronologically speaking, Black Sheep is the postgraduate level movie because we're doing it chronologically. It's the most recent one that we're talking about in this group of three, but it also arguably is the most fun of the three. And so, take that for what it is. But I had a blast with Black Sheep, and I hope you do too. So check it out if you haven't already. So those are our three picks for the animal subgenre of horror, but we've got a few extra credit films that I definitely think are worth your time. The first one we're going to talk about is Crawl. And Crawl is an Alexandra Aja movie, so right off the bat, you know you're going to be in for a gory good time. If you haven't seen Crawl, it came out recently, I think 2019, and it's a movie about a woman and her father stuck in the basement or the crawl space of their house during a hurricane in Florida, and they're trapped with a couple of large alligators. And it's absolutely fantastic. It's an incredible movie, and the only reason that it didn't make the horror movie syllabus proper is because I already had Lake Placid on there, and I just didn't really want to put two gator movies in the animal subgenre. I felt like I just make my own alligator subgenre, and maybe I should have, because I can think of a couple other good alligator movies. Maybe I should have done that, but I didn't. So Crawl misses the mark, but by no means is it because it's not a good movie, because it's great. Um, the movie is held together by the lead actress. Her name is Kayla. Oh, I'm blanking on her name right now. I'll do the thing where I put it on the screen. She's fabulous in the movie, and they do a pretty good job of setting up some things. So, like, for example, that she used to be a swimmer, so that'll pay off in the movie. Barry Pepper playing her dad, he's almost unrecognizable in there, but Barry Pepper always does good work. So the acting is strong, which again in these movies is really helpful because you're basically have one or two characters and animals attacking them. So if they're not good, it can be a bit of a rough ride. They're great here, but the alligators are awesome. And again, if you're like me and you kind of tend to root for the animals, you're going to probably have a pretty good time with Crawl. Again, it's Alexandra Aja. He likes his gore. And he's not shy about putting the violence in there and doing some shocking things. And Crawl is no exception to it. Crawl does some shocking things, and it looks good. The effects are really solid. Again, it's a fairly recent movie, so maybe in a couple of years that statement won't hold up as well. But right now, I think that the effects, the CGI, and everything look really, really good. The practical effects, everything blend together really well. It's an interesting. It's an interesting setup too with the hurricane and everything like that. And it's something that I haven't really mentioned on this video yet, and I should have earlier. But we touched on it slightly with Cujo, which is usually in an animal horror film, the animal by itself is not the only issue or threat. There's also usually an environmental issue, like you're stuck somewhere and there's a hurricane or a sun beating down on the car you're trapped in, or something like that. There's oftentimes a secondary hurdle to overcome in addition to the animal. And in Crawl, that's them being trapped in a hurricane and trapped in this basement that's flooding. And that's, I think, a key thing because it ratchets up that tension like really high. And Crawl is fun, but it's also very tense and very gory. Less of a party movie than some of the ones we've talked about before. It's not as funny and fun as Black Sheep. It's got a couple of funny moments, but it's not. It's not the comedy horror Black Sheep or even Lake Placid. It's really more of a, it's more straight than that, but it is fun, and I do highly recommend it. If you missed Crawl, and I did when it first came out, I had to go back and watch it on video. But if you missed it, go back and check it out. It got a lot of buzz when it came out, and I was kind of like, yeah, whatever. Because again, I can get lukewarm about animal movies sometimes, but I'm glad that I turned around and watched it, because it's a blast, and I highly recommend it. The next extra credit movie I'm going to talk about is Piranha. Now, Piranha came out in the late 70s, and it was a noteworthy B movie. Now, at that time, there's a tremendous amount of Jaws knockoff movies. And, oh, by the way, if you're wondering why you haven't seen any shark movies in this video, it's because there's a whole separate subgenre just for sharks, because I love me some sharks. We'll talk about that next week. But in 1979, which I think is when Piranha came out, there's a ton of Jaws knockoffs coming out. In fact, our friend Josh over at Movie Timelines has recently just done a retrospective of the most notable Jaws knockoff movies. If you haven't checked that out yet, I'll put a link to that because that is a fantastic video. It's really, really good and really informative. Piranha is a Jaws knockoff. It is. But it's one of the more noteworthy ones for a couple of reasons. And maybe these reasons are more personal than widespread, but here it is. This movie scared me so much as a kid because I didn't realize that fish could bite you. And that's because they don't, by and large. Piranhas would, but they're extremely rare, especially where I lived. So I really didn't have anything to worry about. And even then, like Piranha Tech, they're not gonna like devour you to the bone like what's happening in this movie. So this movie really kind of took the premise of a piranha and just ran with it, and that's fun. I revisited the movie not too long ago, and I'll be honest with you, I no longer find it scary in the slightest. It's schlocky, it's silly and fun, and it's the Jaws ripoffness as an adult is very, very apparent to me. I always say if you're gonna rip off the best, then more power to you. But it's fun. It knows what it's trying to do. It's trying to be scary, but it's not gonna land. It's not as intentionally campy as something like Lake Placid, and definitely not something like a true horror comedy like Black Sheep. It's still sitting in that not trying to take itself tremendously seriously kind of space, and that's a good space for it to be in. It's a good movie. I do have fond memories of it. I guess you can hear the hesitation in my voice. I think it's just because I don't know how much my personal nostalgia is playing into this movie in terms of recommending it here for extra credit, but I am just being, transparent about that. But it does have its following. And it has some love. I mean, there was a sequel, which notably was directed by James Cameron, like one of his first feature, if not his very first feature. And really the only movie he ever made that's not good to not great. I mean, every other movie is good or great that he's done. This is the one that keeps him from being an immaculate director. And then Alexandra Aja did the remake a few years back, which was Piranha 3D. That movie's a blast. Not to get too off topic from the original here, but I think I probably prefer Piranha 3D over the original Piranha, just because that one firmly is leaning into the campy, silly horror comedy fun with wild and copious amounts of gore. Just gore everywhere. It's your total B-movie horror film with the violence and the gore and the nudity and everything just ramped way, way up. It's Alexandra Aja just giving you what he thinks the American horror audience wants. He's kind of right. So I definitely would recommend that, but I do recommend the original too. It's not going to be as bugnuts crazy and violent and gory and all that stuff as the Alexandra Aja remake, which by the way has its own sequel, which is it's not as good. It's not it's like trying too hard to do the same thing, and it just doesn't quite pay off. But it's called Piranha 3 Double D. Gives you an idea. But the original, while maybe not as schlocky, gory, crazy, insane as the Alexandra Aja remake, is a quality film. I say quality film not in terms of like it's a quality movie, like it's made really well or a prestige film, but it's a noteworthy film. That's maybe a better way of putting it. It's a noteworthy film in horror history. Amongst all of the Jaws knockoffs of the time period, this is the one that kind of seems to have endured a bit and has it kind of still has a bit of a legacy to it. You'll know we haven't seen an Orca remake or anything like that, but Piranha, they made a franchise out of it. And while it's maybe not the most successful or amazing franchise, it's a fun one and definitely deserves your attention. So check it out if you haven't. And the last extra credit movie we're going to talk about is a movie called Long Weekend. Long Weekend is an Australian movie that came out in the late 70s as well, but is not a Jaws knockoff at all. The movie, if you're not familiar with it, is about a married couple who are bickering. They're not the most pleasant of people, and they go off to the wilderness to have like a vacation, and they're really terrible people who are not very good. They're not environmentally good. They're littering, stuff like that. They're bad to animals. They do some bad things to animals, the environment, and everything. and nature decides to strike back. And then I'll stop there, but right there you can see why I'm into this movie. I told you earlier I like it when you root for the animals. If you're like me in that regard, this is the one. This is the movie where terrible people are gonna be the victims of animals getting revenge on terrible people. This movie has a reputation for if you're into horror and you kind of really get into like kind of the lower tier stuff, the more obscure stuff. You may have heard of this movie, and you may have heard about it being really extreme. It's not. I went into this one expecting it to be pretty dark or pretty gory and violent, or do something shocking or really taboo. Not so much. And there's some of the effects. I got to warn you, some of the effects, especially like the birds attacking, stuff like that, not great, but fun. Very, very fun. Again, like if you're rooting for animals, and these people are despicable, stuff like that. Credit to the actors; they're quite good in conveying this, tumultuous relationship and this disregard for everything around them, this self-centeredness. Really, really good. And I really enjoyed the premise of the movie. Like I said, it could have gone a little farther, and had it gone farther, it probably would have made the syllabus. There was a brief period of time where I was going to put this on the syllabus. It just doesn't quite go far enough. It doesn't quite, if it had really, really pushed their agenda, if it really had gotten, really dark or intense or something like that, it might have gotten the edge and maybe would have bumped like Black Sheep or something off of the list. But it didn't. But I still wanted to mention it here because probably a lot of you haven't heard of it before. And I think it's worth watching. I think it's worth checking out. Apparently, when I was doing the research for this video, there's a remake of this that I think stars Jim Caviezel. I'd never even heard about this until doing the research for this video. So that's probably a clue as to the quality or impact of this movie, as in it made no impact on anybody because nobody knows about it, apparently. I don't know. Maybe I'm being cavalier. Maybe there's a ton of fans for it. Maybe in Australia it's a huge movie. I don't know. I didn't get that impression from anything I saw. Sounds like they made a remake about this movie and nobody cared. And it's probably because hardly anybody knows the original as well. But that's kind of a bummer. The original movie is definitely worth checking out. Again, it's a fun twist on the movie where you're actually kind of rooting for the animals, and that's the intent of the movie, as opposed to me who's just rooting for the animals because I want to see a crocodile eat somebody. So there's a long weekend for you, and I really like it. So go ahead and check it out if you haven't. So that's all we've got for you for the animal subgenre today. Thank you very much for your attendance on this one. And if you've got other animal horror movies that you think I should have brought up here, drop them in the comments below. Sometimes it's just ones that didn't make the cut or maybe going to pop up in other subgenres, but sometimes they're not. And I've been making my little to-watch list based on some of your recommendations. You guys have come up with some really good ones, and I really need to get into them. So if you're thinking of ones that I haven't mentioned here that you think should have been mentioned here, drop them in the comments below because all of us get the benefit from your suggestions as well. So with that, thanks again for spending your time with me today. I really hope you enjoyed this one because I did too. And with that, we'll go ahead and say, class dismissed.